Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I'm a single mom who's been through hell and back with my ex-husband. We met young, got married quickly, and had our son when I was 24. Things were okay at first, but then my ex started showing his true colors. The verbal abuse started small. Little comments here and there about my cooking, my appearance, how I was raising our son. Then it escalated. My son was only 6 when I finally gathered the courage to leave. The divorce was messy, and despite the documented history of abuse, the court still awarded joint custody. They said my ex had shown improvement through counseling. I had to accept it, even though every fiber of my being screamed against it. Fast forward to now. My son is 13 and things have gotten complicated. The custody arrangement was working, sort of, until 5 weeks ago. That's when everything changed. It was my ex's day to pick our son up from school. Instead, my son got on the school bus and came straight to my house. When he arrived, he ran straight to his room and barricaded himself inside with furniture. I called out to him, asking him to come out so we could talk about this. He shouted back that he wasn't going to his father's house and would never go back there again. After an hour of coaxing, he finally came out. His eyes were red from crying. Through his tears, he explained that even though his father wasn't as bad as he used to be, being there brought back memories of everything, the yelling, the hitting, and how scared they had been. He insisted he was old enough now to decide where he wanted to live. I explained to him about the court order and that I could get in trouble if I didn't encourage him to go. He responded that I should let him get in trouble instead, saying it was his choice. I called my ex to explain the situation. When I suggested he try talking to our son, he dismissed it, saying our son was just being dramatic and telling me to make him get his things ready. I tried suggesting they start with something smaller, like lunch. He reluctantly agreed with a dismissive whatever. My son did reach out later, asking his father to have lunch one weekend. His father's response was predictable. He said he was busy and brushed it off with a vague promise of another time. For 5 weeks, my ex didn't make any attempt to see our son. Then yesterday, he sent my son's grandmother to pick him up. She tried to convince him to come along, saying his father wanted to see him. My son refused, telling her to let his father know that if he really wanted to see him, he would have made time for lunch when asked. I've been documenting everything. Every refused visit, every attempted conversation, every time my ex has, or hasn't, tried to see his son. I even spoke to the school guidance counselor, hoping for some advice. The counselor told me about how my son had been coming to her for years about the abuse. She explained about his diagnosed PTSD from his younger years and noted that he seemed much happier now that he wasn't going to his father's house. When I brought up my legal obligation to encourage the visits, she pointed out that while that was my obligation, it wasn't hers, and added that in her professional opinion, children his age should have a say in these matters. Yesterday, I received a certified letter from my ex's lawyer threatening to take me to court for violating the custody agreement. I immediately contacted my own lawyer and showed her all my documentation, the text messages, emails, the notes from the guidance counselor, everything. My lawyer was actually encouraged by this. She explained that given my son's age, his PTSD diagnosis, and my ex's lack of effort to maintain a relationship, we had a strong case to modify the custody arrangement. She assured me that the court would take my son's wishes into consideration, especially given the history. We filed for an emergency modification of custody the same day. The hearing is set for next week. My ex can't seem to understand that his actions, both past and present, have consequences. He thinks a court order gives him the right to ignore our son's emotional well-being. For now, I continue documenting everything while working with my lawyer to protect my son's interests. It's not about being entitled or defying court orders. It's about protecting a child who's finally found the courage to speak up for himself. I'm a high school senior, and our school's volleyball team needed to raise money for new uniforms and equipment. We decided to organize a weekend car wash in the parking lot of our local supermarket. The store manager was kind enough to let us use the space, and we set everything up early Saturday morning. As the team captain, I was in charge of organizing the shifts and making sure everything ran smoothly. My dad, who's always been super supportive of my volleyball career, helped us set up the stations and stayed nearby to keep an eye on things. Since he owns an auto detailing business and knows all about proper car washing techniques, everything was going great for the first couple of hours. We had a steady stream of customers, and people were being really generous with their donations. We had a system where one person would direct cars to wait in line, while others would wash and dry the vehicles. It was working perfectly until she showed up. This woman in a black SUV came screeching into the parking lot, cutting off another car that was already waiting in line. She started honking her horn repeatedly, and I could see her gesturing wildly through her windshield. I politely told her there was a line and that we'd get to her car as soon as we could. She responded by demanding to know who I thought I was, declaring that she doesn't wait in lines. She got out of her car and I could tell right away this wasn't going to end well. She was wearing fancy clothes and had that typical haircut. I tried to explain calmly that while I understood she was in a hurry, we had other customers waiting and it wouldn't be fair to skip them, but I couldn't even finish explaining before she walked up to me. She started calling me horrible names, accusing us girls of being tramps and saying we were out there in our shorts washing cars like common street workers. I attempted to explain that we were student athletes just trying to raise money, but that only made things worse. That's when it happened. She slapped me across the face so hard that my ears started ringing. The shock of it made me stumble backward, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. She continued her tirade, calling us worthless and accusing us of trying to get attention from men. What she didn't realize was that my dad had just pulled up to drop off more supplies. He saw the whole thing happen from his truck, and I've never seen him move so fast in my life. Before anyone could react, my dad walked right up to her and delivered the hardest slap I've ever witnessed. The sound echoed through the parking lot like a thunderclap. My dad angrily confronted her about daring to put her hands on his daughter. She immediately started threatening to call the police, clutching her face and screaming that my dad would go to jail for assault. My dad calmly told her to go ahead and call them, suggesting they'd be very interested in hearing about her assaulting a minor. She did call the police, screaming into her phone about being attacked. When they arrived, they got multiple witness statements from the other customers and my teammates. There was even security camera footage from the supermarket showing her cutting the line and attacking me. One of the officers recognized her from previous incidents at other businesses. Turns out she had a history of assault and disorderly conduct. They arrested her right there in the parking lot, and she was screaming the whole time about how she'd sue everyone. The charges against her ended up being pretty serious: assault on a minor, disorderly conduct, and making threats. My dad was in charge because multiple witnesses confirmed he was defending me from an adult who had just assaulted his minor daughter. The story spread through our small town pretty quickly, and our car wash ended up raising 3 times more money than we expected. People kept coming by all day, not even getting their cars washed, just dropping off donations and telling us how sorry they were about what happened. Some even brought us snacks and drinks. The woman eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, got community service, and had to take anger management classes. The judge also ordered her to pay a fine that, ironically, went straight to our volleyball team's fund. We ended up getting not just new uniforms, but also new equipment for the whole team. Her community service ended up being cleaning at the local recreation center, including washing their vans every week for 6 months. I've been working in corporate environments for over 15 years, starting from the bottom as a data entry clerk and working my way up to senior operations manager. I've seen my fair share of difficult bosses, but none quite like the one I'm about to tell you about. Throughout my career, I've always been known as someone who gets things done efficiently. I developed this reputation by finding smart ways to work around outdated procedures while still maintaining quality and compliance where it actually mattered. This approach helped me climbed the corporate ladder at previous companies, and it's what landed me my position at Maxwell & Brooks Consulting 3 years ago. The company was great at first. Our department head understood that some policies were outdated but trusted us to use our judgment while still maintaining professional standards. Under his leadership, our office consistently ranked in the top 3 for productivity across all branches. Then he retired, and that's when everything changed. His replacement arrived on a Monday morning wearing a suit that looked like it had been ironed twice and shoes so polished you could see your reflection in them. During his first department meeting, he didn't even introduce himself properly. Instead, he coldly told us that we should address him only as Sir or Mr. Director. He then went on to say that while our numbers looked acceptable, he was deeply concerned about our lack of policy adherence. I tried to point out that our efficiency ratings were at a 5-year high, but he dismissed this, stating that numbers weren't everything and that policy compliance was what built a strong corporate foundation. He mentioned he'd already noticed several violations that morning, including improper document handling and informal email signatures. When one of my coworkers tried to point out that some of these policies were outdated, our new boss cut them off mid-sentence. He said if something was in the manual, we had to follow it, no exceptions, and he would be monitoring everyone closely. That's when I decided to show him exactly what following the manual really meant. I spent that evening reviewing our company's policy manual, dating back to 1995. What I found was a goldmine of absurd regulations that nobody had bothered to update. The next morning I arrived exactly at 9 a.m. and not a minute earlier or later, as per policy. I then submitted a formal written request to turn on my computer, as specified in the Technology Usage Guidelines from 1996. When he saw the paper on his desk, he asked what it was. I explained it was my computer access request form, citing policy 96-014, which required all computer usage to be pre-approved in writing. He told me this was ridiculous and to just turn on my computer, but I reminded him that he specifically said no exceptions and that I was just following the manual. He huffed in frustration but signed the form anyway. That was just the beginning. By lunchtime, I had plastered my cubicle with the mandatory safety signs from 1998, including classics like caution, monitor may become warm during use and warning, keyboard contains keys. I also submitted 17 separate supply requisition forms, one for each paperclip I needed, as per policy 97-223. My colleagues caught on quickly. Our receptionist started logging every phone call in triplicate using the required carbon paper forms from 1995. The accounting team began converting all financial figures to both dollars and the defunct European Currency Unit, ECU, as specified in an unupdated international trade policy. The real chaos began when I discovered policy 95-118. All internal communications must be verified by at least 2 department heads and stamped with the official company seal before distribution. The company seal hadn't existed since the Clinton administration. When our boss demanded to know why no one had responded to his emails, I explained that we couldn't read them yet because they hadn't been verified and stamped. I innocently asked whether we should use the company seal from 1995 or wait until a new one was commissioned. After 3 days, the office was drowning in paperwork. Every simple task required multiple forms, approvals, and obsolete procedures. Project deadlines were approaching, but we were all too busy following policies to actually work. The breaking point came when our quarterly review was due. I submitted everything in the required format on 5.25-inch floppy disks, as specified in the 1995 data storage policy. When he declared this unacceptable and demanded to know how he was supposed to read it, I suggested submitting a policy exception request form, noting that it was only 27 pages long, required 6 executive signatures, and needed to be notarized by our legal department, which had been outsourced in 2010. He finally snapped. He called everyone into the conference room immediately, his face red as a tomato. He accused us of thinking we were being clever, to which I innocently replied that we were just following every policy to the letter, exactly as he wanted. When he tried to backtrack by saying he meant only the important policies, I asked him to point out which policies were important and which weren't, since I must have missed that section in the manual. The regional director happened to be visiting that day and overheard our conversation. She stepped into the conference room and asked if there was a problem. I explained everything, showing her the ancient policy manual and our strict compliance with every single rule. She actually started laughing and commented that not only did their policies need updating, but they also needed a leader who understood the difference between maintaining standards and creating obstacles. 2 weeks later, we had a new department head who immediately launched the policy modernization initiative. As for our by-the-book boss, he was transferred to the records archival department, a perfect fit for someone so fond of outdated policies. They found my detailed documentation of the whole situation so helpful for policy revision that I got promoted to process improvement specialist. I've always been the responsible one in my family. Since I was young, I watched my parents struggle with money, living paycheck to paycheck, and I promised myself I wouldn't end up in that situation. While my younger sister was out buying the latest phones and clothes in high school, I was working part-time at the local grocery store, saving every penny I could. After graduation, I took a job at a manufacturing plant. I lived with roommates, drove an old car, and packed my lunches. Meanwhile, my sister went to an expensive private university, dropped out after 2 years, and started jumping between retail jobs. Fast forward 7 years, and I've managed to save up a decent emergency fund, about $45,000. It's not enough to retire on, but it gives me peace of mind knowing I'm prepared for unexpected expenses or job loss. I even managed to put a down payment on a small condo last year. Then last week, my sister showed up at my door unannounced. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. She immediately told me she needed my help because she was in trouble. When I asked what was wrong, she admitted that she had messed up and was in a lot of debt. She then proceeded to tell me how she'd maxed out multiple credit cards, taken out personal loans, and was even behind on her car payments. The total, around $38,000. She desperately explained that she needed me to help pay it off, insisting that I was the only one who could help her. I was shocked by the amount and asked her how this had happened. She claimed they were all emergencies, listing things like car repairs, a new phone she needed for work, and some medical bills. But as she kept talking, it became clear that her emergencies included vacation trips, expensive restaurants, and shopping sprees she couldn't afford. I suggested she consider talking to a financial advisor or looking into debt consolidation. She immediately dismissed these ideas, saying they would take too long. She explained that creditors were calling her every day and pleaded with me, pulling the family card. When I refused to give her my savings, explaining that I had worked years for that money, she lashed out. She accused me of being selfish, pointing out that I had all this money just sitting there while she was drowning in debt. The next day, my phone started blowing up with messages from our parents. My mom demanded to know how I could refuse to help my sister, insisting that family was more important than money. My dad chimed in, saying they had raised me better than this and that I needed to step up and be the responsible one. I defended myself, explaining that I was being responsible and that's exactly why I had savings in the first place. My mom then tried to guilt-trip me, asking what would happen if my sister lost her car and where she would live. The pressure kept mounting over the next few days. My sister even posted vague messages on social media about how some people only care about themselves and money changes people. Our extended family started calling, all taking her side without knowing the full story. Finally, I'd had enough. I gathered all her credit card statements and loan documents that she'd shown me and created a spreadsheet. I highlighted all the emergency purchases, the $2,000 shopping spree at various stores, the $3,000 vacation to Cancun, the $1,000 concert tickets. Then I sent it to our entire family group chat, explaining that these weren't emergencies but choices and I wouldn't empty my savings account to enable irresponsible spending. The response was immediate. My sister broke down crying, accusing me of humiliating her. My parents were furious that I had aired our dirty laundry. But our aunt, who works as an accountant, finally spoke up in my defense. She agreed with me, explaining that this wasn't about family helping family, but about enabling bad habits. She pointed out that if my sister got bailed out now, nothing would stop her from doing it again. That seemed to change the conversation. My parents finally stopped pressuring me, though they're still not happy. My sister blocked me on everything and moved back in with our parents. Last I heard, she's finally talking to a credit counselor and looking into legitimate ways to manage her debt. I still feel bad about how everything went down, but I know I made the right choice. My savings stayed intact, and hopefully, my sister will learn something from this experience, though I doubt she'll ever thank me for it. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.